I don't have too much of a fear of things like public speaking. And I think that's purely because of the performing I did from a young age as well. I mean, and I think when I was quite young, I mean, I first performed at the Opera House when I was 6 years old. And I think as a 6-year-old, you don't quite have a concept of big stage, opera house, what you're doing necessarily to have those nerves kick in to the same degree as we do as adults. Once I became conscious of performing and people watching, I always experienced a sense of nervous energy and a bit of anxiety before performing. But I think it's really important to consider the relationship with nerves. Like, nerves are not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, a handful of times I haven't been nervous when I've performed. That's when I've been sort of mentally a little bit more worried, because I know nerves help me actually perform my best. They give me that sense of adrenaline and, you know, help the fingers move faster and easier, and give that sense of rush that can be quite helpful. Nerves mean I care. Like, I'm nervous because I want to go out, I want to do a good job, I want the people in the audience to like it and to clap at the end and to, you know, enjoy the experience. So that's not a bad thing. The fact that I care is a good thing. And I try and remind myself of that if ever I am worried about the nerves.
Hello and welcome back to the Emil Barna Podcast. In episode 5, I will be meeting with Dr. Anastasia Hronis, and I'm hoping I pronounced that one correctly. Anastasia is a clinical psychologist, and she's the founder of the Australian Institute for Human Wellness. That's an organization that's dedicated to meeting the growing need for innovation in supporting mental health and well-being here in Australia, as well as worldwide. Now, services that Dr. Anastasia provides are individual and group therapies, specialized well-being to support performing artists, seminars for workplaces, school-based interventions, and psychology-informed consultancy services is also part of her practice. Now, Anastasia is an honorary associate at the University of Technology in Sydney, where she provides lectures and research supervision to students in the Master of Clinical Psychology. She completed a PhD in the area of mental health treatments for children with intellectual disabilities, and she continues to conduct research in disability, addiction, gambling, group therapies. And she's presented at a number of really prestigious international conferences and been published in very prestigious journals as well. Anastasia is a classical concert pianist and has won numerous national and international awards. And she's performed multiple times as a soloist at the Sydney Opera House. And her most notable solo performance was at Carnegie Hall in New York. In today's discussion, we cover trauma, we cover performing artists, intellectual disabilities, and CBT, the difference between how cognitive therapies and body-based therapies differ. We talk about performing arts and how her experiences with being a pianist, how that has shaped her into a person and disciplined her to get to where she is today. I really enjoyed this discussion, and without further ado, let's get stuck on into it. Hello, Anastasia. Thank you so much for joining me on the Emil Barna Podcast. I was really excited to chat a little bit about what it is you do and kind of move forward from there. You got a ton of research interests and some good clinical expertise that I'd be picking your brain with. But for those listeners out there who don't know who you are, can you give them a little bit of a background on what you're all about?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for asking me to come on the show and to be a part of this. So my name's Anastasia Hronis. I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm a practicing clinician, but I'm also involved in conducting some research. I founded the Australian Institute for Human Wellness, through which we do a range of things. We offer clinical services, we do some research through the Institute as well, and offer a variety of programs for organisations, schools, workplaces, etc. And I do some lecturing and research supervision at the University of Technology, Sydney. So my research interests are, well, I have a few. So my PhD was in looking at how we can adapt cognitive behaviour therapy for children who have intellectual disabilities, and evaluating a program that we developed. And then I've also got research interests in addictions and primarily gambling, both problem gambling and this sort of concept of responsible gambling as well. And some of my students are looking into sort of group work and the positive benefits that come from the processes of being involved in groups specific to addiction therapy.
Wow. There's a lot. There's a lot there. You've been very well versed in experience from the clinical point of view and the research element. And you have presented overseas as well at international conferences on, from what I've seen around your bio. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I was super fortunate it was 2019 before COVID and everything hit. I went to Switzerland, I went to London, and I went to Berlin for some international conferences, and so I had 2 trips to Europe in 1 year, which was I was just spoiled, but it was really wonderful. The conference in Berlin was the World Congress for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, if I've got that right. But it was fantastic to just hear from clinicians and researchers from all over the world coming together to present on the newest developments of therapies that fall under the broad umbrella of cognitive and behavioral therapies.
And did you present at that conference as well?
Yes, I did. I presented on some of the work I'd done in the development of the CBT program that we created for children and adolescents with intellectual disabilities. And at that time, we had done some evaluations of it through schools as sort of group CBT. And we had also done evaluations of it one-on-one through the clinic. And that was towards the end of my PhD, where I had some results that I could present on. So yeah, fortunate enough to be supported by the university to go overseas and present there.
That was the Fear Not program. Have I got that right?
Fearless Me.
Fearless Me. Sorry. Yeah, I'm really intrigued with that one because you'd come across a lack of support for people who had intellectual disabilities, because I mean, CBT being the gold standard for many clinical psychologists, that just didn't really vibe for people with intellectual disabilities, especially kids. Tell me a bit about how your program came about and what it kind of entailed. If you can give us some practical examples, that would be great. Some stories there.
Yeah, absolutely. So CBT is traditionally a sort of talking heavy therapy. It doesn't lend itself naturally quite well to children and adolescents who may have some difficulties with processing information and that cognitive component of it. So what we found was that most of the interventions that had been applied for children who had these sorts of intellectual disabilities had been either medication or very sort of behavioral approaches and strategies. And there had been some emerging research to say that adults who had sort of mild to moderate intellectual disabilities could engage with CBT if it was sort of adapted for their learning needs. But when I started my PhD, nothing had been done looking at whether the same could apply for children and adolescents. And so there was research to say that, well, actually, people with intellectual disabilities can do the foundational work of CBT. So they can identify what their thoughts are, they can make the links between a thought and a feeling, and they can have some recognition over whether a thought is rational or irrational. So the foundation's there to be able to do CBT they were there. And so it was just like, how do we, we're not reinventing the wheel here, it's basic CBT, but how do we make it more user-friendly, essentially? So part of what I did was try to break down CBT into the smallest components possible. So one of the first steps was just getting children to identify the difference between a thought, a feeling, and an action. Which perhaps for someone who didn't have an intellectual disability might be an easier process, but just required a bit more practice for these children. And we created an online platform as well that's not meant to be a standalone sort of online therapy, but rather an adjunct to make the therapy more fun and engaging. And it had some like practice tasks that the kids could do at home, sometimes with the assistance of their parents. And I mean, we haven't conducted sort of a larger scale RCT, but from the trials that we did, we had great success. We were targeting anxiety specifically, as this is the most common sort of mood disorder we find amongst kids with intellectual disabilities. And we did find that the majority of children did have reductions in anxiety going through the program. So some promising initial results from it.
How do you measure the reduction in anxiety?
So we did have some basic self-report measures from the children, and we also had measures from the parents and from teachers as well. So kind of collating all that information. And we also did qualitative interviews with the parents and children to get, as you were saying before, those stories of, at the start of the start of the program, my child had this particular phobia, and since going through it, they've been able to, no longer sleep in mum's bed, but now they can sleep in their own bed with the night light on. So we were also able to gather those stories that helped confirm for us that something was working.
Wow. Do you have any accounts that kind of stick out for you? Some kids that really benefited a lot from that program that just stick with you years after?
Yeah, absolutely. We had one young person who was quite claustrophobic, and even in the therapy sessions, the door had to be open, and so through the process of particularly working with the cognitive components of some of the irrational thoughts that were attached to the claustrophobia, we were able to get him to be in the car without the windows necessarily needing to be open, which is fine if it's a warm, sunny day, but not always practical if it's cold in the middle of winter and there's other people in the car. To be in the clinic room with the door closed, things like using public bathrooms. So we were able to see on a practical level some of the success that he had.
All right. Since then, has your interest continued in treating people with intellectual disabilities, or have you kind of diverged out to broaden your therapeutic horizons and kind of conduct research and practice in different areas?
Yeah, I've continued to do some, I guess now I'm working with some of the students who are taking the lead in some of these projects and working with children with intellectual disabilities. But I have also been doing research in another area, which is of great sort of interest and passion of mine, around addictions, gambling, and group work. So at the moment, two of the students are looking at sort of attachment styles and how they impact the, I guess, therapeutic benefit we get when we are engaged in group therapy. I'm a big advocate for group therapy. I think it's fantastic. I love running groups, and I think it just offers something that it's so powerful. It offers something that individual therapy can't.
Behind me, you can't see it, but at the top shelf, I've got Irvin Yalom's group therapy manual. That I've got to say, that manual is one of the most readable textbooks I've ever come across in my life. He's got just such a great way of writing. How do you conduct group therapy?
A variety of different ways, I guess, depending on the group. But I'm a huge fan of Yolom's work, and I mean the reason why I was so interested in this is to understand those process factors that are at play when we're running groups. You know, the shared experiences and how powerful that can be, in that sense of catharsis within a group and learning from other members in the group, and you know, the processes rather than the content of what perhaps as a group facilitator we might be sharing with the group. I think it just can be incredibly powerful.
It kind of, in my mind, it can fly in opposition to a lot of CBT, which is very content heavy rather than dynamics. How did you make that integration between what you were taught in terms of a cognitive behavior and then focusing on processes and like what actually define those for me, processes and dynamics for those who might not be aware of what they mean and how they're different to just content?
Yeah. So I kind of like simplify it as the content is the what, like what are we doing in the group? Am I teaching a particular strategy of distress tolerance? And the process and the dynamics is the how, like how is this being received amongst the group? How are the group members relating to one another as we talk through this, you know, particular strategy? What else is coming up that's sort of beneath the surface and not specifically related to the what that we're doing. So I kind of think of the what and the how, and trying to integrate both of those. Whatever the sort of focus of the therapy is, always, I guess, for myself, being really conscious of both, because there are times where we do need to be really skills focused and strategy focused, but not ignoring the potential that can come from the processes that are still going on within the room. And as like my research interest is, you know, as a facilitator of a group, how can we make the most of those processes? How can we use them? We might be aware of them, but how can we actually use them to facilitate the group as best as possible?
Do people, I'm sure you may have gotten this along your way in day-to-day life, do you try to pick up on dynamics, or you see dynamics that are happening in and around you, and you can kind of pick up what's lying underneath that process, just in relationships, in how people relate to themselves, each other in the classroom, or the rest of that? Do you kind of see it from that lens?
Sometimes. I think sometimes I also try and switch that part of my brain off day to day, going through sort of normal life. But yeah, certainly, if I sort of tune into it, I guess as therapists, we're sort of trained to notice these sorts of processes and can choose to focus on them and pick up on them. But I just think like there's incredible power. I just, as you were talking before, remembered I was running a group therapy program for people with addictions, and one of the exercises we had done was writing a letter to your addiction, and then sort of standing up in the group and reading it out loud and sharing these. And I mean, I do similar things often with people in a one-on-one context, where I'll ask them to do that exercise, come back and read it to me, and it's really powerful. But like amplify that by 10 people in a room who have lived experience and understand, you know, on some level one another's stories. And we just had like the room of people like in tears at points, hearing one another's letters, but in a very sort of like cathartic, helpful way. And it was just so powerful. Like that memory of that particular group always sticks with me.
So it can really or be with you for a very long time after that, when that catharsis is just experienced within more than one person. rather than just a day-to-day connecting with one person that you might trust. There are many groups available, especially for addiction, things like AA or NA, or things like Smart Recovery, or how do you kind of approach groups in those in addiction, for example?
Yeah. If I'm running addiction groups, I'm personally looking at integrating sort of skills and process. So I might sort of run sort of CBT or DBT based programs that really look at kind of strategies to get through day to day, maybe a bit more of a model based on like a smart recovery group. And we find that once people have some stability in their recovery, perhaps a period of sobriety, we then move on to doing some of the more process-based work, but maybe only once they have sort of some solidarity and some skills to fall back on to help them through that. But at the same time, I'm a huge advocate for the other groups that are out there, like Smart Recovery and the 12-step programs as well.
There's a bit of debate these days. Even more recently, I came across a thing. The Cochrane report came up with another report that evaluated 12-step programs. At one point they said they're effective. At another point they say, hey, they're not effective. You have the disease model of addiction. Then you have the more social model of addiction. You have different countries that take one approach and other countries that take another approach. How do you stay sane in all these different kind of fights that happen within the field?
Yeah, it's hard to keep up with at times. But I guess like trying to take that, like what the literature says and what the reviews are saying, and sort of taking that down to like, the individual person sitting in front of you, and how you can best help them. I think there is just that element that different things are going to work best for different people. And even when I'm talking to clients initially about the difference between going for an approach of abstinence versus harm minimization, like it's going to be different depending on the person, what their goals are. And there's actually there's a saying in the 12-step programs, and they say something along the lines of, take what you like and leave the rest. And I think that's a really like nice way of summing it up, because not everything is going to work for everyone, and there's no Bible manual as to this is the only way to do addiction recovery. So here are the options. Take what you like, see what works for you, and leave the rest. And I think they've got that spot on.
Yeah, there's over 400 plus different therapies that our field has spouted out across the years. And from a common factors point of view, if we speak to clinicians, you have certain elements, one of which is the therapeutic relationship and how you connect with somebody else. I could imagine that is even more important within a group context, and that can come out to have better results, I would think.
Yeah, that sense of cohesion within a group can be so important, and a lack of cohesion as well can be problematic within groups. But yeah, and again, like a question that comes to mind for me often within groups, like how do we as facilitators try and best enhance the group cohesion, and make the most of it?
Any quick tips?
I was just about to say, I don't know that I've necessarily got all the answers for that, but certainly things like, having shared common goals within the group. So one of the things I found is that if we have a group, and speaking to addiction specifically, where everyone's goal is abstinence, as opposed to some having a goal of abstinence and some having a goal of harm minimization, the cohesion in terms of a common goal can really help. Also as a facilitator, like involvement from group members, like as much as possible. And even for some people, like in a similar way, which they do in the 12-step programs, handing over responsibility to some of the group members, like, and I thinking of like small examples. We would do some mindfulness practice, and it would be, one group member's responsibility to put on the door the sign that said, practicing mindfulness, please don't enter. But sort of trying to reduce the sense of, I or we are the facilitators and you are the group members, but hey, we're coming together with our knowledge and experiences and collective wisdom, and everyone in the room has got that, whether you're someone who's experienced the addiction or on the other end of facilitating the group. How do we come together cohesively to do the best we can?
It really speaks to safety within a group, if you, as safe as you feel. I remember doing some training in groups, and though I don't do that as part of my day-to-day, it was one of the most memorable process to see the facilitator in the group that she was facilitating share what she was going through in the moment and her own experiences with the group as a teachable moment. And I think the different groups have different ways of doing that. In your experience, do you tend to take an open approach to kind of sharing and that sort of stuff?
I do. I do to a degree. One particular, like I saw, I had kind of like to backtrack a bit. I had a moment in my learning that sort of changed how I worked as a clinician. And I saw Marsha Linehan live doing some DBT training. And it was in a room full of, like 1,000 people in Sydney here somewhere. And I was so impacted by her training and teaching because she was just herself. Like, there was no therapist behind the clipboard. You're over there, I'm over here. Like, she was very authentic and genuine. And that didn't necessarily mean she sort of had to overshare to be that way, but she was just naturally comfortably herself. And I walked away from that training being like, I want to be like Marsha. So I like to try to be as authentically genuine myself as I can when I'm doing consultations or group work, whether or not that means I sort of share things about myself. I guess I pick and choose that as I go. But I'm a little bit like, what you see is what you get. This is me. So that people feel like they're talking to the real person rather than just the therapist.
What advice would you have to other clinicians who think, hey, blank slate, cannot know anything about me, you're not allowed to ask, don't even think about it?
Yeah. I think everyone's going to have a different style. And it might be a bit of trial and error, like figuring out what feels more comfortable. And in a similar way, like different clients are going to respond differently to different therapists. So some clients might really like the, therapist behind the clipboard, very, very sort of boundaried. It's not really a word, but you know what I mean. And other clients may not respond to that. So I don't know that there's a one size fits all, but just if we, I think as clinicians, feel as comfortable as possible, that's going to help in building the therapeutic rapport with clients. And we know that's one of the biggest predictors for therapy outcomes. So I try to look at it that way.
A wonderfully diplomatic response, Anastasia.
Thanks.
Let's shift gears a bit here, because this is what catches me. You're a concert pianist and you've played in front of many people. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So I started learning the piano at a very young age. I was 3 years old. And I think my mum at the time thought, well, she doesn't have much else to do, so here you go, learn the piano. But I'm so fortunate that I did start at an early age, because it was something that was just, it's been with me my whole life. And so when I was at university, I was at this crossroads of trying to decide which path to do. I was very interested in psychology, but also really loved music and performing, and tried to sort of keep both going as long as possible. So I did do a music major along with my psychology degree, and have done some performing. I've performed at the Sydney Opera House, and then in 2015 I kind of had the peak of my music career. I was overseas in New York and performed at Carnegie Hall, which was one of the most incredible experiences of my life. And since then, I've sort of focused more in terms of being a psychologist, but have tried to focus a lot of my work in working with people who are in the performing arts and entertainment industries, and how to best help them with, I guess, the unique stresses that they can often face that I hopefully have a bit of insight into.
I want to pick up on that point. Before I do, though, performing in front of thousands of people as musicians, as you've done before, that brings up an incredible amount of, either anticipatory anxiety, just a lot of stuff leading into it, and then kind of just doing that. How has that shaped you? And we work with fear, a lot of the time. How have you learned along the way?
Yeah, well, I think for one thing, it's helped me be comfortable in front of audiences. I don't have too much of a fear of things like public speaking, and I think that's purely because of the performing I did from a young age as well. I mean, and I think when I was quite young, I first performed at the Opera House when I was 6 years old, and I think as a 6-year-old, you don't quite have a concept of big stage, opera house, what you're doing necessarily to have those nerves kick in to the same degree as we do as adults. So starting from a young age really helped with that. But absolutely now, and once I became conscious of performing and people watching, I always experience a sense of nerves and nervous energy and a bit of anxiety before performing. But I think it's really important to consider the relationship with nerves. Like, nerves are not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, the handful of times I haven't been nervous when I've performed, that's when I've been sort of mentally a little bit more worried, because I know nerves help me actually perform my best. They give me that sense of adrenaline, and help the fingers move faster and easier, and give that sense of rush that can be quite helpful. And I always come back to sort of nerves mean I care. Like, I'm nervous because I want to go out, I want to do a good job, I want the people in the audience to like it and to clap at the end and to enjoy the experience. So that's not a bad thing. The fact that I care is a good thing, and I try and remind myself of that if ever I am worried about the nerves.
What does it take to make a concert pianist?
Practice is the short answer. I think as with anything that's kind of done to a high or elite level, it's a lot of hours of practice.
So being disciplined and putting your hand out. What was your what were your main areas of discipline that kind of translated from playing the piano and disciplining yourself in that area, but also to day-to-day life? Are they relatable? Are they transferable?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think something like music required me to be very consistent. I couldn't just sort of cram a couple of days before and go out and perform on stage and do a good job or enter a competition. So it taught me to be disciplined in a constant kind of way. Like, I practiced almost every day. And I think that's translated into then, like me, say, studying at university or working on different projects. I can be quite consistent. I'm not much of a crammer. I can work on things bit by bit and don't sort of procrastinate and can get them done. So that sense of discipline, I think has helped me in other areas of my life, especially particularly at times when I might have been, I don't know, doing my PhD or studying and thinking like, oh, this doesn't feel like it's getting anywhere, to just sort of stick with it and know that the hard work pays off.
For people who find it very difficult to discipline themselves, or just are waiting for motivation to kind of just hit them in the head before they even step out and do anything, what kind of words do you have for people who find themselves in those situations?
Yeah, I think motivation rarely comes if we just sort of wait for it. If anything, like if there have been times in my life like that, the longer I wait, the less motivated I kind of feel. But I think, speaking for myself, and I think other people would have had these experiences as well, starting something off, even if it's the smallest first step, that helps build the motivation and the confidence and self-efficacy to then be able to do the next step and the next step and the next step. So I don't think waiting for motivation is a good strategy. I think it's a matter of going out there. If we can just overcome that initial hurdle to start something, and build from that, we'll have greater success.
You must have come across many people in your time, both in personal life and in your professional life, that are just like, I don't have any motivation to do anything. Or especially in depression, people who find themselves like they can't physically bring themselves, or people who are withdrawing from substances, they don't have that motivation. In those situations, what have you found to be the most helpful?
Yeah, I think two things, like from a kind of CBT perspective, when we're looking at the behavioral component of trying to get someone out of that period of depression, we look at things like behavioral activation. So what are those small steps that you can take that day to help build that sense of motivation and just getting up and about and doing things? Like, you got out of bed and you had a shower, great. Like, is that a possible first step, or does that feel too big? And let's see what an appropriate first step for you could be. At the same time, we often find that people who are struggling with these sorts of things have a very strong internal critical voice that is also serving as a massive barrier to them doing whatever it is they need to do, or to sort of come out of that period of depression. And we find this to be the case also within, as you mentioned, like people who have addictions. And so we want to find that balance between, yeah, great, like we want you to get up and take those steps, whatever those steps may be. And at the same time, we want you to be kind to yourself and compassionate to yourself, and not overly critical if you don't get to do all those things, or if you don't achieve that goal that you had for today, because that's going to spiral us right back into that negative, self-critical place. We're going to feel worse about ourselves. We're going to feel less likely to get up and do things, and then we spiral further downwards. So it's a balance of doing what we can, setting those small steps to push ourselves, but being kind and gentle along the way.
Yeah. How long does it take to develop a habit in that time?
How long is a piece of string? I think it depends. It depends on so many things, but one of the things it depends on is like how deeply ingrained that self-criticism is. Like, is this a way that you have been relating to yourself and talking to yourself since you were a young child, and you've had 40, 50 years of practicing it, and how much do you believe that part of yourself? Because we all have that sort of inner critic, but the degree to how awful it can be and how punitive it can be, and also how much we believe its messages can differ. So I think that in itself plays a big factor into how long it can take to sort of change some of these patterns for someone.
Mm. I mean, there is research that I've come across, but I can't remember exactly the amount of days that it generally takes a person to form a new habit. But something like 66 days is one number that sticks to my mind, and I wonder whether that's a consistent effort over time, every single day, like brushing your teeth. You know, it's kind of like, what's the smallest possible step that you can do to gain, a sense of moving forward.
Yeah.
One thing that I mean, to answer your question about how long is a piece of string, it's always twice the size of half its length. So that's the answer to that one. That was a dad joke. Anyways, let's move forward to something different. You mentioned performing arts, and I think performing arts is a really interesting one because that over the past year or two, or year and a half now, they've been devastated with COVID, shut lockdowns and all that sort of stuff that's been happening. Can you speak a little bit about the unique challenges that people who are in the performing arts experience?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, there is often a lot of job uncertainty anyway for people who are in the performing arts and entertainment industries in terms of when they might get their next gig or auditioning for a new production or show and whether they're going to get that. But add the uncertainty of COVID and lockdowns into it, and it's just amplified. Um, so I think there are unique challenges that people within the performing arts do face. As I mentioned, the sort of job uncertainty being one of them. They're also in environments where there is a lot of criticism, whether it's you're going for auditions or you're getting sort of maybe reviews if you're sort of in the public eye or the show that you're in is in the public eye. If rejections, you're often going to lots of auditions, applying for lots of different roles, a lot of rejection. And these are people who have dedicated a lifetime to trying to perfect or get as good as they can at something they're very passionate about and means a lot to them. So that in itself, just dealing with those criticisms and rejections can be quite difficult. Often there are elements of travel involved, which makes it difficult to stay connected with family and friends, establish routines. I mean, for some of us, myself included, I don't travel that much, but getting a gym routine is something I seem to struggle with, and I wouldn't want to throw, having to travel for long periods into the mix. So there's a lot of factors that they face relating to their work. That can be challenging. For some people as well, it's a lot of time on your own practicing. A lot of musicians, it's hours a day practicing the music that you're working on. So just being able to recognize and work with some of these factors if we are working with clients who are in the performing arts, I think is important.
And also the sense that comes about how hard it is to get into the industry, the performing arts industry, and to become well known, and for that to become a career for you. That does that become a huge kind of block for people? Like, well, yeah, I'm investing all this time. Where the hell is it going anyway?
Yes, yeah, it's extremely competitive, and people often end up having to potentially, like, while they're in that process of trying to make it, do other jobs along the side. And so often we hear from people, I spent how many years and how many hours, how much time, effort, money into sort of trying to perfect this craft and this skill, and now I'm working in a job completely unrelated to that. um, I'm at the local cafe, waiting tables, but what I really want to do is perform. And I've spent so much time and effort trying to do this. And, where is it getting me? I'm not getting there. And that frustration that comes with that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because the performing arts aren't something that's highly valued within the school curriculum. At least you've got drama classes and that sort of stuff, but from the academic point of view, they're not seen as viable and money making endeavors comparable to things like big business and that sort of stuff. Whereas they're the things that bring us the most happiness. We sit down, throw our feet up, and you watch Netflix or you listen to music. You play the piano, and these are things that really get us going as humans. It's an odd sort of relationship we have with that.
So true. It's so true. These are the things that we would miss so much if we didn't have them, and the things that bring us comfort and pleasure. Um, and yet there isn't quite the same focus on the arts as, for example, I always make the comparison. We have particular degrees that you can do to become a sports psychologist. It's valued that there are unique stresses and factors relating to people who are in the sports and elite athletes. And what we're talking about is people who are essentially like elite athletes in their own field, but we don't have a specific degree as to how we can help these particular clients. So even just that comparison really often stands out to me.
I've never thought about it like that. You're right. You're totally right. Sports psychology is a field, just like organizational psychology and clinical psychology. But I mean, a performing arts psychologist, like you have coaches, you have people who do coaching, but that's a tough one. Okay. Yeah, I think there's a calling in it for you, Anastasia.
I'm trying, and I mean, there's some great organisations, particularly in Melbourne. There's recently the Arts Wellbeing Collective have been established through the Melbourne Arts Centre, and they have fantastic resources for people in the arts, and they have a 24-hour hotline as well, specific for people in the performing arts. So it is starting to get more recognition. But it's slow.
So performing arts, we've got addiction, we've got group work, we've jumped around to a few things. Tell me a little bit about the other interests that you have that you may not have spoken about to myself or to others in terms of what's online, but moving forward with your own research interests and saying, okay, well, I want to dedicate to this, or this is what I'm doing here, and I want to move forward there. Where are you at in this area of your life? You accomplished so much. How do you move forward?
That's a good question. The other, I mean, I'm interested in lots of things, and maybe that's not always a helpful thing. I'm quite interested in, I think, working with people with trauma, personality disorders. So a lot of my clinical work, along with addictions, is looking at, addictions and mental health have kind of been separate for a long while, but really they need to be integrated. We can't look at an addiction without looking at sort of mental health, and even in terms of government funding and models, they've been quite separate, which I don't think is a helpful thing. But I think in that, like a lot of the sort of therapeutic approaches I work from are DBT and schema therapy approaches, and looking at the whole person rather than just the addiction or the anxiety or the trauma, but how do we look at this person as a whole rather than sort of categorize them and treat them as a whole person in the therapy room.
DBT is very skills based. For those who aren't aware of DBT, can you define it and explain it briefly?
Yes, I will do my best. So dialectical behavior therapy is what we would refer to as third wave CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. So we acknowledge that there are these therapies that have come after your traditional CBT that have expanded on the cognitive and behavioral components that we look at when we're doing your traditional CBT work. So under that also fall things like acceptance and commitment therapy, and schema therapy. Dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, was first designed for people who had borderline personality disorder and sort of significant trauma histories. And over the course, it's been found to be helpful and effective for people who are also experiencing self-harm or suicidality, addictions, eating disorders. And so it's expanded, but it is very, as you said, it's very skills-based. So it's often recommended that DBT is done in a group as well as with one-on-one consultations. And we look at 4 kind of broad categories of skills. So there's one module that's about mindfulness. There's one module that looks at how we can regulate emotions day to day. There's one module that looks at distress tolerance and how we can effectively get through the most difficult moments that we experience. And then a 4th module called interpersonal effectiveness. So essentially, how can we best function within relationships with all sorts of different people. But yeah, there's a lot of skills that go into looking at how we can improve those different areas. That said, Marsha Linehan, who's the creator of DBT, like, this is a first phase of treatment, and it's not meant to be the only phase. We do need to then go into some sort of trauma processing, because the majority of clients who would be suitable for this sort of therapy will also have some sort of trauma underlying the difficulties they're experiencing. And if we don't address that, we're not really fully helping the whole person.
One thing to just learn skills on how to manage yourself in your world. The other thing is to address the underlying issue. What about those who just don't want to go back there and don't want to revisit what's going on? They're like, hey, I just want to move forward. Don't want to think about the past. How do you approach that?
There's a few different ways, and I guess it looks at kind of exploring what the block is. For some clients, we talk about this notion of a window of tolerance. So part of the use of helping a client with skills is that we can kind of expand their window of tolerance. So essentially what that means is a client may be able to handle emotions when they're within a particular window. And if the emotions get kind of outside of that, they may become very distressed. So a client who has significant trauma and not very many skills may have a very narrow window of tolerance. So addressing something like trauma would be very difficult for them because their window is so narrow, and it is very likely they'd be experiencing emotions outside of that window. So I'd be looking at kind of what the block is, and again, like, what's going to be best for this particular person to reach their particular goals. And, one size doesn't fit all.
And those who just block or dissociate's a different element, but just try to block out what's happened before and shut themselves off from any memories, thoughts, feelings, and then they function relatively well in day-to-day life. They've got a high-performing job or role, or and they're like, nah, I just don't think about it. That's just something that's happened in the past. Do you see any issues with that?
My like catchphrase that I use is, and I'll often share this with clients, something's only a problem if it's a problem. So if you're telling me you've had trauma in your past, but you function fine, you've got no issues with work, relationships, getting out of bed in the morning, day to day, emotion regulation, you feel fine, then great, go off in the world and do what you're doing, and I applaud you. That's wonderful. So we don't want to pathologize something that's not a problem. Just because someone has had trauma experiences does not necessarily mean that they are traumatized. So trauma impacts people differently. For other people, I would be exploring, like, is it the case that everything is okay, Or is it that there's maybe some stuff we're avoiding and suppressing, and it's popping up in sort of unexpected different ways, and it's maybe worth looking at. But at the same time, like always offering that as a choice that the client has complete control over. When and how they do that, if they choose to do it, is totally up to them.
I think there's a very, very fine line, isn't there, between identifying, is this an issue or is it not an issue, when they've never done any work up until that point. And like, well, if I go and think about it, then what use is that going to do to me? Because it's just going to make it even worse. I'm doing pretty well. I just don't want to think about it anymore. It's a tough line to grab, especially as psychologists and therapists and that sort of stuff. You want to go back. Why are you the way that you are?
Yeah. We naturally want to kind of formulate and make meaning of things, but it may not always be what the client needs. Maybe they just need a couple of skills to get them through those moments of anxiety, and they're good to go. It really depends, I guess. But I heard a fantastic analogy with sort of trying to figure out the ways in which trauma can impact us, and if something is a problem or if it's just something we can leave behind and go forward in life. And I think it's again from the DBT Marsha Linehan course. I think that's where I've heard it from. But this analogy of sort of this cupboard that we might have. And it's maybe a cupboard that's like really messy and it's got lots of things just like shoved in there in no order, and we kind of push it closed. And every so often, you know, a gust of wind might come by or someone walks past, and because it's so jammed full, it opens up and everything that's inside it just kind of falls out all over the floor. And we just like scramble to shove it back in, and we go through this same process. And this is what can happen with trauma, where we push it away, we shove it away in that, you know, part of our brain that's right at the back that we don't go to, don't want to think about. But every so often, something that seems really small or completely out of the blue and unrelated is just that thing that opens up that closet and that cupboard, and everything kind of falls out, and we have this really strong emotional reaction to something that is seemingly quite small. And so when trying to figure out with clients who might have that question of, is this worth me actually exploring and unpacking? That's the analogy I'll give them to try and help them reflect on their own emotions and behaviors. And as I think Marsha says, what we have to do is kind of put those things in the cupboard one by one in a nice, neat order, so that if we need to or want to, we can go open it up, pull something out, put it back in, but it's not this overwhelming flood of experiences that we get out of the blue.
There are certain people who never access therapy in their entire lives, and yet they would carry around a lot of trauma from what's happened in the past, and that will come out in their behaviors or their experiences. What would you say to somebody who doesn't plan to go to therapy, just doesn't want a bar of it, but is open to hearing something that may be helpful in the lines of trauma, stress, fear, that sort of stuff? What would be your words for that, for those?
My suggestion would be, if people are interested, there are lots of great online resources nowadays. You know, podcasts, YouTube videos, online actual courses that are offered. Like I know the MindSpot clinic is a place that does online courses with some like email and phone support. So there are options to explore if you don't feel like you want to or need to take that plunge of going and seeing a therapist. At the same time, I think people are fascinating, and I think any one of us could probably go see a therapist and unpack some stuff about ourselves, and if nothing else, just better understand ourselves and the way we function in our relationships, in the world around us, the relationship we have with ourselves. Like, these are, I think, important things for us to understand that can really help us live a I don't want to use the word happy, but maybe like satisfied, full kind of life.
Mm. Let's try another related question, because I think that's really important. Some that may be contemplating therapy, they've never been there before in their lives. Therapy is not like going to see a GP, connecting or not connecting, and then going to see another GP, fully bulk billed. You only get a certain amount of sessions every year under the Medicare scheme here in Australia. But at the same time, it can be quite expensive for some people. For people who go to therapy and then they meet a really crap therapist, and then they're just like, I've been to therapy, it doesn't work for me. What kind of words would you have to those?
So I'll share a personal example on that as well. Again, like one size doesn't fit all. It sometimes takes a few goes before you find a therapist that you connect with. I myself have seen a psychologist, and I would like to think, being a psychologist, that I would kind of know what to look for in someone in terms of what might sort of suit my style and my preferences and maybe their areas of expertise. And it took me it took me 3 goes. So the third person I saw was the person I stuck with for a period of time. And I just kept that in mind, that I was open to sort of trying different people until I found someone that worked for me. And it does sometimes take a few goes. So don't dismiss the process if you don't have a great sort of first experience with someone.
And it may be fair to say that there are other community health organizations that have different funding that may be able to provide lots of free therapies for those who are interested.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. There's you don't just have to see a clinician in a private practice. There's not-for-profit organizations, there's community mental health, there are other services available where the funding structures are different.
Do you mind if I ask you a personal question about your own journey within psychology and kind of moving forward from there? There are people who are listening who are probably on the journey to become a psychologist, or just wanting to hear more about people's experiences through this podcast. But for you, what got you interested in psychology to begin with?
Yeah, I think I was very interested in the concept of learning. And I think that came from my music background. I was interested in, how does someone learn? How does the brain process information? And I remember when I went to uni, like in my first year of uni, 2 classes in, I was like, I'm going to be a psychologist and I'm going to do music therapy and I'm going to work with children who have autism and various developmental disabilities. And I had this like clear plan for myself of what I wanted to do. And of course that changed a million times throughout the course of me actually becoming a therapist, and still is changing. But I think it was something I was just sort of curious about. It was sort of linked to my music background, and as I went through the training, I just loved it more and more, and decided I wanted to focus more on the sort of clinical side of things. Then when I did my training in clinical psychology, I realized I loved the research component as well, so I took more of a detour to focus more on research, and so I think it's something for me that's evolved as I've gone through and discovered new interests within psychology. It's such a broad field.
It's been quite a process. I mean, we all have our own stories on how we got into this process. I'd like to hear. Here's a bit of a controversial one. Do you feel like some psychology degrees, for lack of a better word, indoctrinate certain therapies that have just been around for so long, when there's so many other more effective things out there that are coming onto the market? Feel free to answer that one if you'd like.
That's a tricky one. I can't speak, like, I guess from my experience going through the course that I did and some of the other sort of clinical programs that I know of, there is a strong focus on CBT. And I can see why, like as a sort of foundational therapy to understand and develop skills. And I think that's really important. When I went through my training, we did also receive some training in mindfulness and mindfulness integrated CBT. We did some schema, some DBT. So we did have exposure to the other therapies. And the notion was, okay, now as a clinician, you get to go out and decide what you do further training and what sort of therapies you upskill in. So, I mean, from what I know of a few courses and for myself in my training, it wasn't too rigid in like, you have to do this therapy and this is the best. And there certainly was an emphasis on doing therapy that had an evidence base supporting it, and certainly not doing things that didn't have that. But it didn't feel too rigid.
Okay. Yeah, not as juicy as I thought it might be.
I do sort of support and believe that having a strong CBT foundation is really important to then go on and be able to do the other therapies that are now coming out and have that growing evidence base. And I think without a good foundation of CBT, we wouldn't be good schema or ACT or DBT clinicians. So I see the value in it, but certainly not the kind of be all and end all.
Yeah, certainly. There is an assumption. This is something that I think I've adopted along the time as well, that thought, in CBT at least, emotions come after thoughts have crossed your mind, whereas there are other therapies that are, diametrically opposed to that. There are certain physical sensations that lead to thoughts, and then there's others that integrate both. I'd be more of an integrative clinician in that sense, but I also see the utility of subconscious processing in terms of what you are not aware of and how that affects you. Can you speak a little bit about the kind of underlying philosophies of things like top-down therapies and bottom-up therapies? Actually, do you mind defining those so I don't have to define them right now?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point and speaks to the ways that different sort of therapy approaches work. This notion of how conscious we are of our thoughts, and that conscious thoughts then lead to a particular emotion and then a particular action we might take from that, versus this notion that we may have some sort of internal process that is not quite at that conscious level that we're aware of, and what that can bring up for us and the reaction that we can have to it. This is where I quite like what schema therapy is able to do, because often clients who might have done some CBT are able to say, well, I can recognize that the thought I'm having, for example, if I have a belief that I'm not good enough, I can recognize that thought isn't really true and that there isn't really evidence to support it, but I still feel like it's true. And so there is this differentiation between what I know on kind of a head level and what I'm feeling on a gut level. And I think schema therapy does a really great job at bridging that gap and not just focusing on sort of change on the more rational level, but bringing about change through experiential exercises and bringing up emotions to help shift and change emotions, rather than taking more of a kind of rational approach.
For those who might not be aware of schema therapy, could you give a brief overview on what that one is?
Yeah. So again, like a form of cognitive behavioral therapy falls under that umbrella of third wave CBT. And looks at a kind of deeper belief level. So a schema is essentially sort of a deeper belief that we might have about ourselves, the world, people, life in general. And sometimes we can be aware of those, and sometimes It takes a bit of digging to unearth them, but often very much based on experiences that we may have had early through our life that shape these beliefs or these schemas that we might have. So we might, for example, have a schema around abandonment, a fear that people might leave me, or a schema around defectiveness, that there is something sort of fundamentally bad or wrong about me. And so we work at not only sort of trying to challenge these beliefs on a rational level, but also do some more experiential exercises that might involve things like imagery work or chair work, or letter writing exercises that are designed to bring up the emotions attached to these unhelpful schemas or beliefs we might have, and then produce sort of helpful therapeutic change to be able to shift the schema itself and the belief that we have and any emotions attached to it.
So things like CBT could be more like your transient thoughts that just pop into your mind, whereas schemas are more in-depth, ingrained, like core concepts of how we believe.
Yeah, similar to kind of like core belief work that we might do in traditional CBT, but adding in the kind of experiential elements to it that CBT doesn't.
Anastasia, thank you so much for your time, being so generous with your time. If people wanted to learn a little bit more about you, where can they find you?
So they can look up the Australian Institute for Human Wellness, where there's a bit about the sort of clinical work we do, some of the research work and sort of various services that we offer. Also through the University of Technology, Sydney, they can find me there, particularly if they want to talk all things research.
Thank you so much. This has been a really, really great discussion. Thank you so much, Anastasia, and I look forward to moving forward with this.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.